We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. Israel turned thousands of Lebanese people into human bombs on Tuesday with a sophisticated terrorist attack. People's pagers exploded at the same time at 3:30 p.m. all around the country. The next day, Wednesday, the Israelis carried out another major terrorist attack. Today, we're talking with Layan Sima Fuleihan. She is a Palestinian organizer with the Shut It Down for Palestine coalition. She's also a popular educator, organizer, and the education director at the People's Forum. Layan, welcome back.
Thanks for having me on, Brian.
Well, let's get started. There's so much to talk about here. One is I want to talk about the U.S. media coverage, which is sanguine about the terrorist attack. I mean, the headlines are really, truly disgusting. Israel's pager attack has no clear strategic goals. It's a tactical success, but what was the point? No emotive outpouring of outrage over what was clearly a terrorist activity. We want to talk about that. But there's a lot more to talk about. Why did Israel do this? How long have they been planning it? Is it related to Gaza or is it related to Lebanon? And then the other thing I really want to talk about is the history of U.S.-Israeli aggression against the people of Lebanon. It's gone on for more than a half a century. And American people, the people in the United States at least, don't know that much about it. This latest terrorist attack, again, financed, paid for by the United States government. It's not an isolated incident. There have been so many acts of aggression against the people of Lebanon, starting with the U.S. Marine invasion of Lebanon in 1958 when Eisenhower sent 10,000 Marines. There's a lot to talk about, and we're going to cover all of it. But, Layan, let's get started. You know, there's speculation in the U.S. media that this terrorist action was designed to bring Hezbollah to the negotiating table because there's been a lot of, back and forth firing of missiles and rockets between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. In the northern part of Israel, 100,000 Israelis are still homeless in that part. So part of the speculation is this was designed in order to bring Hezbollah to the negotiating table, like a negotiating tactic using terrorist methods. Another idea that's being, talked about is this is Netanyahu's efforts to promote and provoke a regional war. Anyway, there's more options too, but let's get started. I want to get your take.
Well, Brian, I think that what you said is exactly right. The number one characteristic of all the reports on U.S. mainstream media and Western media in general is this kind of dispassionate, almost bored tone, kind of just speculating about what this could mean, and no one really grasping the severity of this attack that Israel has carried out against the people of Lebanon. Just to back up for a second, imagine that any of your communication devices could turn into a bomb. This can strike fear into the entire world. We all rely on communication devices of all kinds. The idea that one country could do this to the people of another country is completely out of bounds of any kind of, I don't even know what to call it. It's outrageous. It's purely a terrorist attack. That said, there are many different versions of why this might happen. And of course, we want to know why Israel did this. We want to know what's behind their thought process of carrying out such a terrorist attack, because we want to know what's coming next. We want to be able to understand the shape of this war as it's proceeding. And so there's a variety of different versions, like you said, circulating along the media. There's one version that's saying that this is possibly an attempt to convince Hezbollah to negotiate. And just to think about that for a second, there has been the U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein who's been going to Lebanon for the past 9 months, supposedly trying to get some sort of deal between Hezbollah and Israel to calm down the tensions and the back and forth on the border. Hezbollah has insisted that their actions are tied to what is happening in Gaza. And what they are doing is showing the need and putting pressure on Israel to reach a ceasefire in Gaza and stop the genocide in Gaza. This has been the consistent position of Hezbollah from the beginning. What the United States is trying to do, and you can kind of see it in some of the reporting, there was a quote from, I forget the name exactly, maybe we can find it a little bit later, from some strategic official from some think tank about the Middle East, quoted in the New York Times, who said, this is Hezbollah's own trap because they tied themselves to what's happening in Gaza. So they have limited their options for de-escalation. It's an interesting way of phrasing it because actually if you think about it in terms of the actual context of Israel's genocide and war across the region, it's Israel actually who has tied themselves to what is happening in Gaza because they are the ones who are refusing to reach a ceasefire deal, and they are facing now multiple fronts of conflict that they have to deal with. So it's a complex situation. It's one version of the story that's circulating, and it's certainly one that is making a lot of grounds in the media.
The New York Times, just to go back to your point, the very passive, not angry, not outraged kind of coverage by the media, signaling that the U.S. is cool with it. It's just a matter of whether it's an effective tactic or not. Or whether it has a strategic outlook. I mean, here's some of the headlines. I mean, just look at some of those headlines. Israel's pager attack has no clear strategic goals. Pager attack embarrasses Hezbollah, but may not deter it. And what's the third one? Okay, I can't quite read it. But anyway, you get the point. It's very passive. It's very dispassionate. And here's from the New York Times. The operation gives Mr. Hochstein, he's the U.S. envoy to Lebanon, supposedly there for a ceasefire. The operation gives Mr. Hochstein, quote, another tool to use when he speaks with Hezbollah. Quote, you better reach an agreement or you'll face a more substantial and surprising attack or attacks. This is the language from the New York Times. It's another tool. I mean, okay, everybody. Yeah, I mean, you could make the argument that, when, Al-Qaeda bombed the Twin Towers and took down or attacked the Pentagon, that there was a strategic and a tactical purpose of the attack. Can you imagine the U.S. media saying, well, they had a tactical success because they knocked down the World Trade Center and killed thousands of civilians? But was it really a strategic success? I mean, would there be this kind of coverage, say, if Hezbollah sent to thousands of Israelis explosive devices in their telephones, in their pagers, and suddenly at 3:30 in the afternoon tomorrow in Israel, and say in Tel Aviv, that thousands of Israelis were just, turned into human bombs? Can you imagine what the American media coverage would be? Would it be another tool in the toolkit for Hamas to negotiate an exit of Israeli forces from Gaza? Would they be talking like that? Anyway, I'm obviously my questions are rhetorical, Layan, but when I read the media coverage, I couldn't be more outraged.
I mean, it's just more proof, as if we needed more proof, that the mainstream media, the capitalist media here, is completely tied up with the U.S. project, the U.S. foreign policy, and is kind of just reporting in a way that supports whatever is convenient for the White House. I even saw a headline, I can't remember now if it was a New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, where they said, this is like Hezbollah's October 7. And if you remember the reporting around October 7, and the kind of moral outrage that soaked every article coming from these same media outlets, if they are calling this an October 7 for Hezbollah, what does it mean then about their reporting? I mean, just the spread of the injuries and multiple casualties, multiple people were killed. And remember, who uses pagers? It's not just people who are active militants of Hezbollah. It's also people who are doctors, people who are emergency personnel, anyone who needs to be reached quickly. And if you're doing this in another country, you're going to reach all those people who use this device. So it's really a terrible, outrageous, inhumane, a clear war crime, and the U.S. media is washing it clean for the U.S. public.
No question about it. I mean, you can see the videos. I mean, people are like standing in a grocery store, and one guy's pager goes off. I think this is some of the B-roll with that. His pager goes off. He's taken down. Other people in the area are hurt. There are almost 3,000 Lebanese people who were injured on Tuesday at 3:30 p.m. More than 10 are dead. 2 of them are children. I mean, why is the U.S. media so sanguine about this terrorist action by Israel? Why is there no big speech on the floor of Congress? Why is there such a sort of tepid, passive, dispassionate response? Well, because the U.S. doesn't care about it, or maybe the U.S. wants it to succeed. Maybe the U.S. capitalist media, which is an echo chamber for the military-industrial complex, an echo chamber for the Biden administration's imperial policies, maybe they want it to succeed. They're proud of Israel's technological prowess. I know you've seen several of these articles talking about the great technological prowess. Here's the Wall Street Journal, everybody. Osher Asar, a managing partner at Israeli cybersecurity consulting firm Oran, said that based on the footage of the explosions, it was clear that the explosives were inserted into devices ahead of time, since lithium batteries catch fire before exploding. Now here's the kicker. Asser said that such an operation would have taken a long period to plan, at least a year, according to his assessment. What? A year? Well, that would be before October 7th, Layan. Go ahead.
Well, if we think about what Israel does and how Israel acts, this kind of action is not that surprising in the end. We've just witnessed 1 year of a genocide in which Israel is repeatedly claiming that they're trying to defeat Hamas, and even sometimes going on record to say that they are not trying to kill civilians. But their very own military doctrine says that to defeat an enemy force that uses methods like guerrilla warfare, which, of course, the people that they're fighting against are under occupation and have no other choice, that this can only be defeated by killing all the people around it, by causing civilian casualties. This is Israeli military doctrine. We're seeing it in real time right now in Gaza, now also again in Lebanon. But we saw it, and it was documented very clearly in the 2006 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. This is Israel's MO, that in order to, as they say they're trying to do, defeat a particular force, they attack the entire civilian population. The United States, of course, shares these objectives with Israel. They are not interested in, some sort of agreement with Hamas or agreement with Hezbollah. They do not want these kinds of this organized resistance present in the region. So to me, it's not that surprising, actually, that this is what Israel is doing. It's horrific. It's horrible. And it's part and parcel of Israel's military strategy, not just over this past year, but for their entire existence.
You know, the Israeli society is in crisis. Obviously, it's very divided. Huge numbers of people are demonstrating against Netanyahu. Those demonstrations, by the way, show absolutely no concern for the Palestinian victims who are suffering in Gaza, or almost no concern. But there is polarization in Israel. Okay, so that's one thing. The fact that the Israeli tourist industry has been deteriorated because of Netanyahu's nonstop war, that's creating economic problems. The fact that 100,000 people who live in the northern part of Israel, close to Lebanon, have been sort of outside their homes now for almost a year, that's another problem. So Israel has a growing number of crises. Now, there's two options here for Israel. Expand the war, widen the war, go to war again against Lebanon, against Hamas, against Hezbollah, so to speak, really against the Lebanese people, or try to come to a quid pro quo with Hezbollah so that they inflict enough pain and suffering on the people of Lebanon that basically Hezbollah cries uncle and says, okay, we'll come to some sort of an agreement with you. Now this, for our audience, for people who are thinking, well, would the U.S. and Israel really carry out a massive terrorist action like this in order to promote a negotiated settlement of one part of the conflict, meaning in the northern part of Israel, not in Gaza? The answer is look to history. Look to American history to find out whether the U.S. uses this tactic. I'm not talking just about Israel. I'm talking about the U.S. too. Now, in 1988, when the U.S. decided that the Iran-Iraq war should come to an end, the U.S. had basically promoted the Iraqi invasion of Iran after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The invasion starts in 1980. The war went back and forth. The Iranians wanted to keep fighting because they thought they could win the war. And the U.S. wanted to end the war by 1988, but Iran wouldn't agree. There was a shoot-down. There was a shoot-down of an Iranian civilian airliner, Flight 655. People can go to the internet, search for it yourself, Flight 655. It was a civilian airliner with 300 people, almost 300 people on board. It was a regular flight. It went every day or every couple days from Tehran to Dubai. And the U.S. Naval ship, the Vincennes, sent 2 precision missiles and shot it down in mid-flight right after it took off. And the U.S. said, oh, it was a mistake. But everyone at that time thought this was the U.S. sending a message to Iran, unless you come to the table right now, we're going to carry out all kinds of outrages, including shooting down civilian airliners, clearly massive destruction of human life and civilian life. And a couple of weeks later, maybe it was a month or two later, Iran indeed came to the negotiating table. I'll give you another example. In 1991, during the U.S. first war against Iraq, the so-called Gulf War, the Iraqi government wasn't coming to the negotiating table quickly enough, and the U.S. dropped 2 precision bombs into a civilian air raid shelter in the downtown Baghdad, and it had big signs on it that said civilian air shelter. So everybody knew what it was. It was called the Al-Amariya bomb shelter. And it's where the children of Ba'athist officials in Iraq took safe haven. Their moms and dads took them there at night. They put them in the Al-Amariya bomb shelter. The U.S. dropped 2 precision bombs, and the U.S. said it wasn't a mistake. They said they didn't know. They said it was a legitimate target. And they incinerated 1,200 to 1,400 children. And then a week or so later, the Ba'athist government, led by Saddam, started bringing troops out of Kuwait. So the use of terror tactics by the United States or its proxies, in this case Israel, has a historical record. That's why I think we should say if this was an attempt to bring a so-called negotiated end to the conflict in the northern part of Israel, it's one, designed to isolate and carry out more genocide in Gaza, and 2, it's clearly a war crime, and 3, if Hezbollah goes the other route and says, no, we're not going to take it, we're now looking at a regional war, which again, I think Netanyahu is also for. This is the logic of the U.S. Carrying out this kind of blank check policy with the Netanyahu government.
Absolutely. I mean, the U.S. has been posturing, at least publicly, saying that they don't want a regional war, trying even to make some sort of gesture towards painting Netanyahu as a rogue prime minister who's going against U.S. foreign policy, that they don't want to draw the region into regional war. But if you look at what the United States has been doing, they haven't actually made any sort of conditions on Israel. They've still been transferring weapons. They've still been providing cover for the Israelis in the so-called ceasefire negotiations regarding Gaza. They haven't really called Netanyahu to the table and fully exposed him for blocking the progress of the ceasefire negotiations. And they have said time and time again, no matter what, that they will always be there to protect Israel. That said, it's been clear that they would rather not have a regional war. And so Israel has had to find ways, if this is what they're trying to do. Let's say, we don't know. Again, we don't know what the exact reason for this is. It could even be that this attack has nothing to do with the current situation because, like you said earlier, Brian, it's likely that it was planned since before October 7. But let's say that this is an attempt to draw all forces into a regional war and force the United States to back Israel in the process. They would have to find some way to draw the U.S. in some way that's not fully direct, because the U.S. at this point can't go out and say, yeah, we want a regional war, because they've publicly and in their communications have signaled that this is not something that they would like. If you look at the other side, if you look at Hezbollah and you look at Iran, they have been very careful. They have been very careful to operate in a way that would put pressure on Israel without escalating the war. In fact, I would say if you look at the shape of the way the conflict has developed over the past year, Hezbollah and even Iran have been in many ways de-escalating forces in the region. They've been doing what they've been doing to put pressure on, and this is what they've been saying, and it's actually the result in many ways, to put pressure on Israel to and increase pressure towards a ceasefire deal. So it's also not in the interest of Hezbollah or Iran to have a regional war. It's not really Hezbollah or Iran that's escalating right now. So the U.S. has suddenly changed, has been maintaining this tone, saying Amos Hochstein has been in Lebanon constantly saying to Hezbollah, don't escalate, don't escalate, don't escalate. But it's Israel that's been escalating every single time. And this action, this terrorist attack, sophisticated and amazing capabilities that it may display, according to the New York Times, is 100% an escalation. So whether or not they are attempting to draw the United States into a regional war, that is essentially what they're doing. They are escalating the tensions.
One of the things that always strikes me, Leanne, is how stupid U.S. policymakers are. I mean, yes, they're imperialist. Yes, they're managing an empire. Yes, they're primary capitalists. They're the center of a world capitalist system. They're also stupid. I mean, meaning their decisions are so ill-conceived, and there's so many unintended consequences, but consequences that are sort of anticipatable, except this hubris and arrogance where this kind of idea that if we have the most military power, if we have the most capacity to carry out covert operations, if we can inflict the most destruction and death and damage to others, well, we can do whatever we want. And you think about the U.S. supporting Osama bin Laden in order to take down a socialist government in Afghanistan in 1979, in 80, 81. Yes, Afghanistan had a socialist government, and yes, the U.S. was sending military supplies and intelligence to the people who eventually morphed into becoming al-Qaeda, and then they attacked the World Trade Center on September 11th. I mean, there's many, many, many other examples where U.S. policy backfires. The U.S. invasion of Iraq, for instance, in 2003. The U.S. was sure that it was going to create this passive U.S. Puppet regime in Baghdad. Well, right now, Leanne, the government in Iraq, if anything, is the closest friend to Iran, which was the nemesis of the United States. So the U.S. took out Saddam Hussein, who was a sworn enemy of the Iranian government, invaded Iran in 1980, as I mentioned. They took him out because of this hubris and arrogance. And what did they get? They didn't win the war. They didn't win the war in Vietnam. They didn't win the war in Korea. I mean, yeah, they won the war in Grenada. That was a big victory. It was a country of 250,000 people, like 1/4 the size of Washington, D.C. But this hubris and arrogance where the U.S. feels like we can do whatever it is that we want to do. Just to give people one more example, I've said it before, but in November 2001, the Taliban agreed to basically end any armed struggle against the United States after they were evicted from power when the U.S. invaded in October 2001. And they said, all we want is amnesty. We don't want to be convicted and sent to prison. We'll lay down our arms. And Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense at that time, said, no, we don't negotiate with terrorists. And here, 20 years later, the Taliban is the government, and the U.S. was driven out of Afghanistan. I mean, 250,000 Afghans died, but the U.S. lost. I mean, this is stupidity. This is like not really a rational policy, and yet it keeps going and going and going. And ultimately, this is going to be a recipe for disaster. Ultimately, right now, it's a recipe of disaster for the Palestinian and Lebanese people. But ultimately, this is not going to work.
Definitely not. I mean, there's some chatter among different military think tanks like the RAND Corporation and others who have been starting to say things like, this is not working. Deterrence in the region is not working. It's now more of a vulnerability than an actual deterrence factor. But there's nothing really that, if you look at history and you look at what's happening now, it's as if the United States is not learning from its own mistakes. And I think, like you said, it's a policy based 100% on hubris, on the capacity to do whatever they want to do. And the main objective is to have full domination, full power. But it's also an approach that's based on a complete disregard for human life. I mean, if the U.S. had any interest in human life, would they have killed so many Afghans? Would they be sponsoring now an Israeli executed but U.S.-backed and engineered massacre of tens of thousands, maybe over 100,000 Palestinians, live streamed to television? There's no regard for human life in the way the United States makes decisions about its actions outside of the border. And this is maybe a topic for another time. I would say even inside the U.S. border as well. It's all about arrangement of forces to maintain power and dominance in order to maneuver and ensure the best flow of resources that will benefit the United States economy. I mean, this is really at the heart of it, and we're seeing the results of that. In every literary story, in every era of history, this has not worked. At the most dominating and power cannot see its own mistakes. I want to just give one quick example I keep thinking about. It's from a Wall Street Journal article this morning where they got an interview from someone in Lebanon who was educated in the United States, so gave an interview in English, and he was waiting outside a hospital for his friend who had been injured by his pager blowing up. And this guy said to the media, he said, listen, my friend is not a Hezbollah militant, but if need be, he will choose to defend his country and his people if he is being attacked. And this is what the United States can't learn, is that as much as they want to try to use whatever force, whether it's Israel or their own military, to neutralize or exterminate resistance forces, people don't accept to be occupied. People will defend themselves. They will stand up for their own rights. They will stand up for their own sovereignty. And so, in a sense, the United States has criminalized all people who refuse to be occupied, oppressed, and colonized. And this is the result. There's no way to reach all those people, but without trying to strike fear or to kill civilians.
Yeah, and then the designation of anybody who fights back as a terrorist is part of this narrative used by the U.S. media, by echoing the U.S. government, so that any kind of resistance is, one, considered completely caricatured, stereotyped, demonized as just like these violent people, not people actually engaged in legitimate resistance against foreign occupation. And Lebanon was occupied for many, many years after the 1982 invasion, which included the bombing of Beirut. And that's where Hezbollah comes from. Hezbollah comes from the resistance of the people in southern Lebanon that finally, in 2000, drove the Israelis out of their country. It wasn't like just a group of people who decided we're going to engage in, quote, armed struggle anywhere. This was a resistance movement against an illegal occupation of Lebanon. Okay. So the U.S. demonizes anybody who is engaged in resistance. But there's another element that I think is important to point out, especially for an American audience, Layan, about Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not like a shadowy armed organization. Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese government. Hezbollah has elected representatives in the Lebanese parliament. Hezbollah is part of the political life and fabric of Lebanon, and a very significant part. And so the people who have pagers, who were then turned into human bombs by the Israeli military with the support of the United States, they could be, yes, there could be some militants, some fighters. Okay, like the U.S. has millions of fighters who are in the U.S. government army. But there's a lot of people, as you mentioned before, doctors, nurses. There could be people who are drivers of cars, people who work in transportation. I mean, the so-called stronghold of Hezbollah is the southern suburbs of Beirut. If anybody has been to the southern suburbs of Beirut, it's like, go to Queens, go to the Bronx, go to Brooklyn, go to any big urban area, densely concentrated. So if the U.S. media says Israel bombed a Hezbollah stronghold in Beirut, what they're talking about is like bombing a densely populated urban area. And so this language of demonization hides, conceals, camouflages the fact that it's really a war against people. Again, we have to reject the language that it's not just bad, it's not just unfair. It gives you a completely inaccurate understanding of what the situation is on the ground.
Absolutely. It's not just a moral thing, that the language we use, but it is incorrect, exactly like what you just said. Hezbollah is an elected part of Lebanese government. And the south of Lebanon, where the United States likes to remind everyone is where Hezbollah is strongest. I mean, this is a part of Lebanon that was neglected by some of the neoliberal reforms that came up in the 90s and early 2000s. And who is it that built roads? Who is it that built hospitals? Who built schools? Oftentimes, it was Hezbollah. So they are really integrated in civilian life, in civilian infrastructure. They are not just a military force. They're not just an armed force. They are actually a force. They are a group that is organizing daily life for people and that is also defending people against the recurring Israeli invasions and assassinations and killings that they are carrying out across Lebanon's sovereign border. Same thing when it comes to Hamas. I mean, Israel keeps saying that they want to exterminate Hamas. Remember that Hamas was elected to govern Gaza, and they are an actual governing body. So if you actually want to think about this correctly, it's not just exterminating a resistance group. It is exterminating an elected government. It is making they're saying they don't like who's governing, and so they want to change it by killing them all. This is actually what they're doing. And the language of terrorist entity or militia masks the fact that these are not separate groups from the population. These are groups that the population has chosen to govern, just like in any so-called democracy where you're supposed to elect who is to govern. We don't have to get into what the U.S. version of that is, which is purely undemocratic, but we have to remember that this is actually who they are fighting. They are fighting the entire infrastructure of daily life in Lebanon, as well as in Gaza and in Palestine.
Another thing that people don't get in the United States, if they're getting their media and their analysis from the U.S. media, is that this is part of an anti-colonial fight. And it's gone on for a long time. All of these countries in the Middle East were colonized following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. Britain and France, in particular, dominated these countries. And the U.S. was the supporter of these colonial powers after World War II because any effort by the people, the Arab people in these countries to become independent, free, was considered basically a Moscow-inspired communist plot. And the Eisenhower doctrine was proclaimed in order to create, each president has to have their own doctrine. So we have the Eisenhower doctrine. We're going to go over that for people. But that was designed to make sure that the people were not going to become free. They were not going to become independent. And the U.S. used a lot of military power in the region, and people don't quite know about this. But in Iraq had a revolution, an anti-colonial revolution against the monarch, who was basically a British puppet. And that took place on July 14th, 1958, Bastille Day. Probably not an accident that they chose Bastille Day, which was, of course, for those who are not students of French history or world history, that was when the French Revolution started in 1789, the storming of the Bastille. So they stormed the government power. The revolutionaries took power in Iraq, and immediately the British moved in 5,000 troops into Kuwait, and Eisenhower moved 10,000 troops into Lebanon. We're back to Lebanon. We're going to go through now some of this history on Lebanon. I have a clip here about the U.S. Archival media clip about how that was announced to the American people. But the U.S. sent 10,000 troops to Lebanon. Why? Because they were afraid that the Lebanese people, like the Iraqi people, were about to rise up in an anti-colonial revolution. I want to play this clip, and then I want to get your comments.
In the wake of the stunning Iraqi revolt, America intervenes in the explosive Mideast crisis. United States Marines pour ashore in Lebanon, their mission to protect American lives and property and to bolster the rebel-threatened Beirut regime. Curious and sometimes cheering crowds gather in welcome, making this one of the strangest operations of its kind in the history of the Corps. Overhead, fighter bombers of the 6th Fleet provide combat-ready sky cover for the Leathernecks.
Very upbeat coverage there. The Lebanese people were gathering to celebrate the invasion of their country. It's really interesting to hear this archival footage and how, with the music, and it's kind of upbeat, and it's from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli kind of stuff. Anyway, that's Lebanon, 1958.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Brian, because very few people really know about that part of history, but it's actually quite significant, and it is a quite remarkable operation. Operation Blue Bat, I believe, is what it's called, when Eisenhower sent 10,000 troops into Lebanon. And I actually was reading the Eisenhower Doctrine today, just reminding myself of it, and I wanted to read the key points from it. So Eisenhower, of course, like you said, every president needs their own doctrine. Eisenhower wrote, gave this very flowery language here, but he synthesizes his proposal in 3 points. He says, we have these simple and indisputable facts. 1, the Middle East, which has always been coveted by Russia, would today be prized more than ever by international communism. 2, the Soviet rulers continue to show that they do not scruple to use any means to gain their ends. And 3, the free nations of the Middle East need, and for the most part want, added strength to assure their continued independence. So he's kind of laying out that there's this specter, there's this threat of Soviet manipulation or Soviet domination of the Middle East, and that this is a benevolent doctrine, that the United States is coming in to protect the Middle East from the influences, from the incursions of so-called international communism. I mean, it's quite absurd, but if we actually think about what was happening, the Eisenhower Doctrine was delivered in January 1957. What was happening the year before? Actually, a few years before, we had the Egyptian Revolution led by Nasser, and then Nasser in 1956 nationalized the Suez Canal, which was a huge blow to U.S. global capitalism. I mean, the Suez Canal was extremely necessary, it still is, for international trade. The idea that Egypt would dare to nationalize their own territory and the resources on their own territory was a big threat to to U.S. capitalism. The French as well and European powers were not happy about this. So the French moved in to occupy and try to control the Suez Canal. What was happening in Lebanon is that the president at the time, Chamoun, was not really doing anything about it. He was very pro-French, he was pro-Europe, and he was not reflecting the discontent of the Lebanese people about the occupation that the French were leading on against Egypt. And they were demanding that he cut ties. They weren't doing that. Then Iraq had their revolution, and Shamoun got really scared. He's like, "Listen, I'm not liked by my own people anymore. It's possible that they're going to try to have their own revolution." So he called Eisenhower, and this is how the story's told. Of course, the United States has their own hand in all these things, but he supposedly called Eisenhower and said, "Come help, please. Don't let this revolution happen." And then these 10,000 troops landed on the shore. They called them leathernecks because it was a lot of Americans who, will burn easily in the sun, was the joke that was given at the time, and so they were getting suntans on the backs of their necks because a lot of them spent a lot of time on the beach. There wasn't an actual conflict for them to intervene in a large scale. It didn't need 10,000 soldiers. So a lot of them sat around not doing very much until there was a transfer of power. Shamoun stepped down and they left. But this was an example of the beginnings of U.S. policy in the Middle East, which was originally organized around trying to keep Soviets out and to keep communism itself from taking hold, as they say, across the region, to keep the people from rising up against the vestiges of colonialism, because many of these states were now independent from European colonial powers, but they were not independent economically. They were still suffering under neo-colonial policies and the control and domination of their resources that kept them tied to European powers. And so if the people rose up to change that, like what happened in the Suez Canal, the nationalization of resources, the U.S. wanted to make sure to be able to have a precedent to stop it. And that precedent was the fear-mongering around the control and the incursion of the Soviets.
Yeah, it was a very important and interesting period in world history because there was a strong communist movement in the Middle East. It wasn't really dictated to by Moscow, but there was a Lebanese Communist Party. The Iraqi Communist Party played a major role in the 1958 revolution. I would say, if anything, the Soviet foreign policy at that time dissuaded communist parties from actually taking the power in their own name and having socialist governments, because the policy of first Stalin and then Khrushchev, after Stalin died in 1953, was to try to avoid World War III. The Soviets were just emerging 10 years after World War II when they lost 27 million people. And the anti-communist hysteria was so profound in the U.S., the Soviets were worried that if there was a socialist revolution in Iraq or in Lebanon or in Syria, the U.S. would say, "Oh, this is Moscow, that we have to, stop the communists. We have to stop the communist winning streak." They did the same thing in Vietnam. That's why the U.S. basically took over from the French for the war of French colonialism in Vietnam. So the Soviets actually had quite a cautious foreign policy. They encouraged the communist parties to form united fronts with bourgeois nationalist forces who were anti-colonial but weren't going to have socialist revolutions. So the U.S. was just, again, this hubris, this arrogance, and this sort of false view of world politics, but whereby they had all of this military power and they just kept using it over and over again. I want to go back to the Suez crisis for one moment before we go on. And again, just to be really clear for people, and this is, I think, important about what changed in U.S. policy. When the Israelis, the British, and the French invaded Egypt in 1956, Eisenhower opposed the Israeli-led and British and French-supported invasion of Egypt. And Eisenhower said, "No, we're not doing that," because the Eisenhower government didn't want Britain to reclaim control over the Suez and didn't want Israel to become the sort of attack dog for British imperialism. It was only later, after the 1967 war, when the Israelis invade Jordan and Syria and Egypt, and that's when they seized the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights, that the U.S. becomes the a full blank check supporter of the Israeli regime. And there are reasons that this transformation happened. But my point is that U.S. policy evolved over time, but what didn't evolve was the dominant strand of anti-communism and sort of demonizing the people fighting against their own colonial occupation and domination, who basically wanted to be free. Some were communists, some were Baathists, some were nationalists, some were Islamicists, but they wanted to be free people. And this is the sort of the way American politics is filtered, so that whoever is the main enemy, the main target of U.S. imperialism at a given moment in history, all of the aspirations of people struggling to be free get put into that box. They are part of the enemy. They are part of the force that must be destroyed. Go ahead.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it's also proof that the United States doesn't have this kind of special relationship with Israel just because they support the Israeli project and because of their love of the Jewish people or some sort of benevolent reason. That, in fact, they didn't fully back the Israel the way they back it now until later, until 1967, when it became more strategic for them. Before that, it was more France and Europe that was backing this project, and the U.S. was trying to extricate and become the more dominant force in place of Europe. And so they were maneuvering in this way. In a sense, the relationship with Israel has always been a strategic one based on its usefulness for achieving U.S. dominance over the world. And so I think it's important to remember that when U.S. Politicians and diplomats insist that it's some sort of care for the Israeli people or some sort of defense of the Israeli project that comes out of a moral standpoint, it's not. It really is simply because it is useful for the U.S. to continue its imperialist project on the region and on the rest of the world.
Well, let's talk about U.S. policy a little bit more. The objective of the United States in the Middle East and everywhere is to dominate. The use of military means is really in order to accomplish an objective, and the objective is domination. It's in the Middle East, it's in Africa, it's in Asia, Latin America, wherever. So I want to also talk about how we should, meaning progressive people, should understand what the U.S. means when it says it wants peace. Because peace is not simply the absence of war. Peace is also the absence of justice. And, 12 years after the Israelis, with the support of the United States, seized big parts of Egypt and Syria and Jordan, when they seized the West Bank, they seized Gaza, they seized the Golan Heights, there was a peace treaty signed between Egypt and Israel. It was called the Camp David Treaty. It was signed in March 1979. There were earlier summit meetings between Menachem Begin, the head of the Likud party in Israel, and Sadat, the head of state of Egypt, and Jimmy Carter in 1978. So a peace deal was signed. And at the time, everybody in the media, in the U.S. media, said, peace is breaking out in the Middle East at last. But it was a kind of peace deal that was conducive to imperialist domination of the Middle East and conducive to Israeli expansion. And the signing of this peace deal with Egypt had the effect of removing the largest Arab army, the Egyptian army, from the confrontation with Israel over the plight of the Palestinian people. And once it was signed, it didn't lead to peace for Palestine. It didn't lead to a return of the West Bank or Gaza or the Golan Heights. What it did lead to was the invasion of Lebanon. And again, we have to think we're not just for peace and against war, we're against injustice, we're against oppression, we're against imperialism, we're against colonialism, and for the opposite of those things, justice, independence, freedom, sovereignty, or socialism. Anyway, I want to show how the media treated the Camp David Accord, which the Arab resistance, the Palestinian resistance, considered not a peace deal, but an absolute betrayal by the Egyptian government.
From Washington, here is Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. The committee's summit at Camp David is over, and Israel and Egypt have agreed to two documents taking a giant step toward achieving peace in their troubled corner of the world. Israel has agreed to end its military government on the west bank of the Jordan River and to permit Palestinian self-rule there within 5 years, and to withdraw from the Sinai and to establish normal relations with Egypt. President Carter, President Sadat, and Israeli Prime Minister Begin have now helicoptered down to the White House from Camp David and are about to appear in the East Room there to report to the nation and to the world.
Yeah, to people who are not political in the United States, Leanne, everybody thought Jimmy Carter is such a peacemaker. He's really taking a different turn. There's going to be peace now. Finally, the end of conflict in the Middle East. Just the opposite happened.
Absolutely. Jimmy Carter still has that legacy. I think that's how we hear about him in everyday talk and language, because he achieved this so-called peace deal. I mean, I think that's what Biden hopes for his legacy. He would like for there to be, he would like to be the one to negotiate a ceasefire agreement, like Jimmy Carter was the one to kind of claim the success of the Camp David Accords. But I think what you said is crucially important. Peace, we have to define what peace is. In the case of the Camp David Accords, peace, it was maybe peace for Israel and the United States to continue moving forward, but not peace for the Palestinian people or the Lebanese people or the Arab people. If we had a ceasefire agreement with the way in which Israel and the United States are expressing it here, it'll be maybe peace for the United States because they think they'll be able to claim that they have achieved justice, they have achieved a ceasefire. But if you look at what they're hoping for Gaza and for Palestine, they would like for the Palestinian people not to govern themselves. A Palestinian state is not on the table here in the ceasefire agreement. What they would like to do is remove Palestinian sovereignty from Gaza, bring in an independent and international force to govern, and make sure that there is U.S. and Israeli interests are represented in every shape and form in everyday life in Gaza. And like you said before, military is just one of the tools that the United States uses to dominate. Another thing that they're really good at using is soft power, coercion, and manipulation of different world international institutions to serve their own interests. And in many ways, this is more comfortable for the United States in this day and age because people don't want to see the United States killing people directly. It's a lot harder to point it out when it's indirectly and when it's slow. So the United States would like to move to some version of peace that is peace for them because it takes the pressure off of an active military conflict, but it certainly wouldn't be peace in the greater sense for the Palestinian people who would still be fighting for their rights, for their sovereignty, for independence, and against colonial occupation.
Yeah, and that began a period, that Camp David peace deal began a period of collaboration between the Egyptian government, and Egypt is a huge country, huge army, removed them from the confrontation. So very shortly thereafter, the Palestinians who had suffered such a blow in the 1967 war with the seizure of the West Bank, the seizure of Gaza, right? Such a terrible setback. And in 1982, the headquarters of the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, but including almost all of the different parties and organizations or factions within the Palestinian movement, the Palestine Liberation Organization was headquartered in Beirut. So on June 5th, 1982, knowing that Egypt was no longer going to join any Arab coalition to defend the PLO, knowing that Egypt was no longer going to confront Israel if it declared war against an Arab neighbor, the Israelis felt nobody can stop us. And I want to play a clip from June 5th 1982, because, again, it shows that the invasion of Lebanon did not invade Israel. Hezbollah did not invade Israel. This was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the destruction of big parts of Beirut in 1982. This is what came after the peace deal, the Camp David peace deal. Again, meaning peace between Egypt and Israel meant war for Lebanon. Let's listen.
ABC News has learned that Israeli armed forces have completed preparations for a military attack into Lebanon, and U.S. officials believe will strike within a few days, probably this weekend. High administration officials have been alerted that Prime Minister Begin is on the brink of giving his forces a go-ahead, using as an explanation the assassination of an Israeli diplomat in Paris last Saturday. However, it's suspected at the highest level here that an Israeli decision to attack is time to take advantage of the U.S. preoccupation with the Falkland Islands crisis.
Well, just for people who don't know what the Falklands Islands crisis was, Britain was at war with Argentina, trying to retain colonial possession of what the Argentinians call the Malvinas. The U.S. was supporting its British junior partner there. But Israel wasn't taking advantage of the U.S. distraction. The U.S. supported the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And as a matter of fact, then U.S. Marines were brought into Lebanon. That's when, 240 plus Marines were killed in that attack on the barracks. That was shortly thereafter. But 2.5 months after the invasion, Layan, so many Palestinians and Lebanese people were killed. The Israelis occupied the southern half of Lebanon or the southern part of Lebanon until 2000 for another, 18 years. But in September 16th, we're almost at the anniversary right now, just a couple days, the anniversary of the massacre in Sabra and Shatila. Now, Palestinian people are in refugee camps all over the Middle East, including in Jordan and in Lebanon. Sabra and Shatila were two camps. The Israelis had invaded, again, June 5th, 1982. Here's another clip of what actually happened to the people, the Palestinian people living in those camps.
Between September 16th and 18th, 1982, a campaign of killing took place at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Lebanon. What happened was described by the UN as an act of genocide. With the backing of invading Israeli forces, a right-wing Lebanese Christian armed group called the Phalange attacked the Palestinian camps in Beirut. According to multiple reports, up to 3,500 men, women, and children were killed.
So this was a mop-up operation. Ariel Sharon, the leading Israeli general, later head of state in Israel, was there in Lebanon, in Beirut. He said, we came to destroy, and then Sabra and Shatila were in fact destroyed. I mean, the camps still exist today, but thousands of people in about a 24 to 36-hour period were massacred.
It was absolutely horrific, and it's, like you said, we just passed the anniversary, and it's still people who've lived through it, who witnessed it, and even who witnessed it across the world mark this as a very horrific part of human history. It was categorized as a genocide, not lightly. Like you said, so many people were killed, and the thing that was also so malicious about it is that it was Israel used a right-wing Lebanese force to do this. They took advantage and they inserted themselves in the ongoing Lebanese civil war, which was not separate from the Palestinian issue. It was part of the context. And they basically used this proxy force to carry out the majority of the killing. In some ways, they tried to distance themselves from Sabra and Shatila because it really was a mop-up operation. It was completely unnecessary. I mean, the entire siege of Beirut and invasion of Lebanon was unnecessary, of course, from a progressive, from a leftist point of view. But if you think about the timeline of events, the PLO had already left Beirut. They had already left Lebanon, and this happened afterwards. This was just like a another time to show we're in control, we're in power, don't you dare resist. This was the attempt of the Israelis, and they did this by massacring thousands of people, men, women, and children, in a brutal manner, and by empowering right-wing Lebanese forces to carry it out.
Yeah. The PLO is then driven from Beirut based on the U.S.-supported Israeli invasion of Lebanon. The U.S. was not distracted. And the PLO headquarters went all the way to Tunis. I mean, very, very, very far away from the West Bank and Gaza and historic Palestine. A devastating blow to the Palestinian movement at that time. And then Israel occupies Lebanon, the southern part of Lebanon, and resistance starts to grow and really grows. And finally, the Israelis are driven out of southern Lebanon by resistance forces, who the U.S. now says are Hezbollah and other resistance forces. It wasn't simply Hezbollah. But they're all designated by the U.S. and Israel as terrorist entities for using armed forces, admittedly, because they were fighting against the military occupation of Lebanon. So they finally drive the Israelis out. And then what comes next, Layan? The Israelis do one of the things that they do routinely in Gaza, the mowing the lawn kind of operation, like, let's go to war again. I mean, Israel is a warfare state. It's got a lot of welfare benefits for Israeli citizens, paid for by U.S. taxpayers, benefits that American working class people actually don't enjoy in the United States. But it's a warfare state. It's at endless war. The U.S., by supporting Israel, is deciding as a policy choice to support an entity that's constantly at war. And I think that's why the U.S. actually does support Israel. They want, if there wasn't endless war against Lebanon, endless war against Syria, endless war against Iraq, endless war against Iran, those Middle Eastern countries would stop being as poor as they are. They would start to thrive. The combination of war, endless war by the Israelis, paid for by the United States, and sanctions and covert operations, both from Mossad and CIA, they've had a debilitating impact on development in the region. Very debilitating. But then, 2006 comes. So the Israelis are out of Lebanon for 5 years, and the Israelis go to war again. They always find a pretext. I want to play the last clip that we have here. Again, for people who are younger, they might not know that Israel invaded Lebanon just in 2006 and dropped hundreds of thousands of cluster bombs. These are these anti-personnel bombs that explode before they hit the surface of the earth, and they spread over a mile wide, killing anything they hit. They kill animals, they kill humans. They're essentially a war crime, inherently a war crime, because they can't distinguish between who they're killing. It's a weapon that kills everything. Anyway, let's play this other clip.
To free the last remaining Lebanese prisoners, in 2006, Hezbollah ambushed an Israeli military patrol, capturing 2 soldiers and killing 3 others. Now, rather than negotiate a prisoner swap as it had before, Israel went to war. For 34 days, the Israeli military destroyed large parts of southern Lebanon and the capital Beirut. Fresh off its own invasion of Iraq, the U.S. fully backed the carnage.
I mean, it's endless. 1958, 1967, 1982, the occupation of the South, then 2006, and now on Tuesday, Layan, blowing up thousands of human beings, using human beings as bombs, and then doing it again the next day, and then doing it again the next day. I mean, it's a warfare state.
Completely a warfare state. I mean, this last clip that you just showed, there was a clear path. They could have just done a hostage exchange like they've done before, like has been done before. Instead, they had to go in and for over a month, bombard the Lebanese people and kill over 1,000 people. I mean, and destroy infrastructure, destroy bridges, destroy hospitals. This is their routine. This is what they know how to do. And it's all because in the United States, like you said, backs Israel because of this, because the United States is not interested in seeing the people of the Middle East and North African region standing up for themselves and developing their own future and actually being able to reap the benefits of development that human society has produced over the past century, and to be able to then use their own resources and organize their own society in the way that they see fit. I mean, the United States is not interested in this. What is the United States doing in the Middle East right now? They've failed in Iraq. They've failed time and time again via their joint operations with Israel. They failed in Syria, but they're still there. There's still over 60 U.S. military sites across the region. What are they doing? A lot of the time, they're protecting oil fields and sites where they can extract oil and other resources. This is what they're doing in the Middle East. And so for them, it is, of course, much better for the people of the Middle East to be stunted and kept down by constant war, constant military conflict, than it is for them to have to deal with the sovereign states of the Middle East and actually negotiate with them use of resources. They'd rather just be able to take it.
All right, Layan, we're going to wrap it up. I want you to tell people, if you could, where there's an upcoming demonstration, because Benjamin Netanyahu is coming to the United Nations. Many countries will walk out, but all around the New York City at that time, on the 26th of September, large numbers of people are going to be in the streets protesting against this genocidal lunatic at the UN and against the U.S.-Israeli genocide being carried out against the Palestinian people. Where will the demonstration be, and how can people learn about it?
Well, that's right. There's going to be massive demonstration on September 26th at 3 p.m. We're going to gather at 3 p.m. and then march to the United Nations. We'll meet at Bryant Park, but you can stay tuned for updates as we get more info at the People's Forum social media or the Palestinian Youth Movement social media, or shutitdownforpalestine.org. You can get all the updates there as well. It's going to be a massive showing. The idea that Netanyahu can come to the UN and address the international community in the halls of the UN after flaunting every single UN charter, flaunting every single UN resolution about the current state of affairs in Palestine right now, and committing a genocide on live stream TV is totally absurd. This is his second visit to the United States this year. He was just there in July. The protests met him there too, and they're going to meet him here again. The U.S. people are not okay and will not accept that he gets to walk here and address the world from the UN halls while he has basically just flaunted every standard and every norm of what international law and cooperation should look like.
All right. We're going to leave it right there. Layan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Brian.